You're listening to Tim Bulkeley's 5-Minute Bible. Atheists, Fundamentalists and the Bible. Using Scripture. If Scripture is our final authority, here in this life at least, then we have to be able to discuss, or to argue, about what it teaches. We have to have reasons for our conclusions about what Scripture is telling us. But I'm increasingly troubled by the way in which some fundamentalists and some atheists use Scripture. And they do it in similar ways. From my perspective, they make similar mistakes. They address verses to each other rather than whole passages. They discuss the meaning of the words and not what the author meant by the words. They fail to recognize that there are such things as non-literal meanings. And one verse is enough. It doesn't matter if a thing only occurs once in Scripture. That's it. It's in the Bible. Let's take these in turn. First, verses and passages. Citing just sentences is plain dangerous. Jesus said, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." It's in Matthew 5:38. Look for yourself. But that's not what Jesus taught. Paul said, "But if our injustice serves to confirm the justice of God, what should we say? That God is unjust to inflict wrath on us?" Romans 3:5. But taken on its own, that's not what Paul is saying. It's the opposite of what Paul is saying. And it's close to the opposite of what Jesus was saying. It said 3 times in the book of Psalms, there is no God. But the book of Psalms is not teaching practical atheism. No, we need to ask what a passage, a book, or even the whole of Scripture says, rather than what one fragment, one verse, says. And then there's the issue of who means what. It's a cliche, but it's true. Texts don't mean things. People do. Okay, sometimes, like other people, I use the shorthand saying the text means this. But that's not what I mean. I mean that the writer of the text, or the writers of the text, or the people who passed the text down to me, intended to mean this by it. And there's also in there the question of what God means by Scripture. It's people who mean things, not texts. And of course, meaning too is in the ear of the hearer. So we have to ask not only about the authors or writers or passers on, but also about the audience. Who was addressing whom? And not just who, like Paul to the Christians in Corinth, or a prophet to the Judeans or whatever, but also when. What was the background? What was going on at the time? What were the things in the forefront of the speaker and hearer's minds? And what assumptions were they making, which may be different from ours? We need to think about all of these things if we're to seriously address the question of what the Bible is saying. And above all, we have to ask the question, why? What was the writer's aim? What was Paul intending to communicate to the Corinthians? What message did Paul want the Corinthians to get? Why was the prophet saying this to Israel? What change did the prophet want in Israel from hearing him? And of course, once is never enough. You see, there in 1 Corinthians 15:29 we read, "Otherwise, what will those people do who receive baptism on behalf of the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why are people baptized on their behalf?" And there are people who take this one verse and out of it construct a doctrine of baptism on behalf of the dead. You don't find it anywhere else in Scripture, but never mind, it's in the Bible, so let's go with it. Paul's logic depends on his recognizing that this was a practice. There are, of course, room for debate about whether or not Paul approves the practice, but quite aside from that, even if he does, one reference is not enough. It's mentioned nowhere else in Scripture, and Scripture is perspicuous. I've talked about that before. It's an important word, even if it's a complicated one. The Bible is clear about the things that matter. And by that I mean they're repeated in several places, in several ways, so that we can't miss the message. This is not repeated, so it's not part of what the Bible is teaching. Teachers repeat themselves. Preachers say things more than once, like I've just done. And the Bible does it too. You see, both these atheists and these fundamentalists are using Scripture as a weapon. They're using fragments to attack their opponents. Weapons are not sources of wisdom. If Scripture's a weapon, then Scripture is not a source of wisdom. Use means to employ. If you employ something, you're the boss. But when I approach Scripture, am I the boss? Who's changed by the reading of Scripture? Neither the atheist nor the fundamentalist are respecting the human authors of Scripture. Or come to that, the divine author. The Bible was written to different people at different times and places, and that's how God chose to communicate. And if we're going to discuss what Scripture means, we need to take that seriously. And we need to take their different purposes, styles, and rhetorical flourishes seriously too. Because all of that is part of what the Bible is. There'll be more in this series, I expect. God bless.